what is going in a positive direction? The first thing is refining standards and regulations. I think that this is all going in the right direction. You're probably aware, hopefully, that WCAG 2.2, that's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.2, was released at the tail end of 2023 with some new success criteria. So at last, we had a new version. So that's great. There's been an update to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, in 2024. So that formally sets WCAG 2.1 as the technical standard for all public web apps and documents, includes public bodies, government sites, apps, including procured and outsourced suppliers. We've also got Section 504 amendments. So again, this is mainly affecting the USA. And that includes healthcare sites, apps, equipment, self-service kiosks. And alongside that, there's actually a proposed bill in California that would expand liability even to developers. So give consumers with disabilities and businesses the right to sue developers for creating sites that are inaccessible. And the reason why I think this is actually a good thing, I'm not an overly litigious person. I don't like the idea that we have to resort to laws to kind of force people's hand. But I actually think all of this is going in the right direction. Whether that's a good idea to sue developers or not, I'm not sure. But the fact that there are more laws coming out, it is empowering disabled people. And I think in the accessibility space, unfortunately, there's not enough talk of people with disabilities. And there's not enough ways for them to be empowered to challenge when they encounter barriers in the web, day-to-day life. The tech is everywhere now. So all of these things are a good thing for those people. And we have the European Accessibility Act next year. So 2025 is the compliance deadline. It's called the EAA. It will set standards to make products and services accessible to people with disabilities across the EU. It will affect wider than that. So any business or person who does business with people in the EU, they will also have to be compliant with this law. And I really like this. It's only at group draft note stage from the W3C, the ethical web principles. I really love this. It focuses on human rights and inclusivity and web design. It touches on accessibility, inclusive design, even sustainability. For example, did you know that PDFs are much worse for the planet than HTML because of the different data size? So it's not all just about accessibility, but it does touch on accessibility. And of course, we have WCAG 3.0, a working draft, which is a next generation accessibility standard under development. Now, I don't want to hype this up too much because it is still quite a long way off. It is only at working draft stage. But the key message here is that WCAG 3.0 needs you. The goals for WCAG 3 include making the standards easier to understand, covering more user needs, including more needs of people with cognitive disabilities and baking that into the standards, being flexible to address different types of web content, apps, tools, and organizations. And I've included a link here, but you can find it very easily if you look up the standards and guidelines for WCAG 3, the introduction. It explains how to contribute. And the key message here is that WCAG 3 might take, it might take 20 years before it's actually going to launch, because there's so much that's changing in it. But we need accessibility professionals. We need people to contribute. And I'm guilty of this myself. I'm only just starting to look into this about how I can have a voice in here and how I can help shape these standards. But the more people who get involved, who get how to contribute, the quicker those standards are going to become a reality. So I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at that. Another great thing, and the good, is that there seems to be a growing appetite for accessibility. I'm hearing loads of organisations starting to talk about shifting left, so moving accessibility earlier and earlier in product design processes. But they're still committing to audits more than anything else, but it's still a good thing. They are paying attention to accessibility. I mentor a lot of developers. Developers, designers, and content creators are absolutely crying out for training. They want to know about accessibility. Diversity, equality, and inclusion, otherwise known as DE&I efforts, are becoming more mature. The growing number of lawsuits, like I talked about before, are actually driving action at last. So we're getting a lot of people coming to us saying, can you please check our website is accessible? Can you help us develop a maturity plan? Because we know that there's some new laws coming down the line. So if that's what it takes to get the motivation to actually pay attention to accessibility, it's a great thing. And of course, artificial intelligence is changing everything. So you're hearing about it all the time. It is just changing everything. It's the one topic in webinars. I think I get invites to about 10 AI related talks per week. You hear about it in every single space, but it's actually having some really good effects on accessibility. So looking at AI in particular and some emerging trends there. There's some great things that it can do, like auto-generated captions, transcriptions, image alts. It doesn't always get them right. It definitely needs human analysis. We need humans to check them, but it can do some amazing things. It can analyze user behavior and preferences and tailor the digital experience to individual needs. It can adjust font size, color contrast, navigation, and it can help us do all of these things faster and make sure that they get covered. It can also do auto-translation. It's often AI driven now. And the beauty of it now is that it's able to listen and even suggest better phrasing. It's not flawless, but it is getting there, and it's getting better all the time. So this could allow like cross countries, across different nations, different languages. It can just help people communicate better. And it could also really help disabled people who speak different languages be able to connect and communicate with each other and access services no matter where they go in the world. Virtual assistants, a lot of people don't think of that as AI, but think about how much that has helped people. The fact that you can do so much hands-free now, that you can talk to your Alexa or to Google or to whatever other tool you use and get assistance. You can ask them to set reminders. You can set smart home devices or make phone calls. All of that stuff is amazing for accessibility. And biometric validation. That's made things much easier a lot of the time. So people can use their fingerprint or face scanning technology. It's making it easier for a lot of people to log into services as long as those services and those journeys have been planned in an accessible way. So by that, I mean that they don't just rely on biometrics, but as long as it's a piece of the picture and it's been thought through. You always want to include different alternative means so that people can log in, they can find passwords via different means. But this is a great step forward, and think about how much easier it has made it for so many people. Looking at some specific technologies, when I started looking into the influence of AI, one of the ones I really loved was this Microsoft Seeing AI, which you might not have heard of. But it's an artificial intelligence application developed by Microsoft specifically for iOS devices. And what Seeing AI does is it uses the device camera to identify people and objects and then audibly describe those objects for people with a visual impairment. And there are loads of innovations like these coming out all the time. This is just one example. Facial recognition, text recognition, emotional recognition from facial expression, even automatic lip reading now can happen, all through the use of this technology. Another one I absolutely love is this empathic AI app. So this says, the slides are a picture just from the home screen of their website, and it shows that you can understand how a non-verbal person is feeling by recording their voice for a few seconds. Empathic app and API support people with communication difficulties due to autism, stroke, dementia, intellectual disability, and a range of conditions. And then they have different portals for healthcare professionals and family carers. But this app, what's really amazing about it is it's all about understanding how a non-verbal person is feeling. It's very, very frustrating for non-verbal people if they can't communicate their emotions, if they can't communicate how they're feeling, and carers or health staff, supporters don't understand it. It's so frustrating on both sides. Whereas AI can interpret very short voice recordings of people who can't use functional speech or most communication aids, and it can translate it into explaining what their needs are. So I just think it's amazing that it can communicate emotion, which isn't something that we think of when we think of AI. We think of very practical things. We don't necessarily think of things like emotion and how someone is feeling. And I just think that that is mind-blowing that they're even able to do that. Another fantastic one is context-aware AAC. So AAC means augmentative and alternative communication, like communication boards for nonverbal people with motor disabilities who might rely on computers, or they don't even have to be high-tech boards to converse with others. And this slide says, it's a quote, a direct quote that says, typical typing rates are 5 to 20 words per minute, while a typical speaking rate is in the range of 100 to 140 words per minute. This communication gap affects the quality of everyday interactions for people who rely on computers to communicate. So there is a communication gap there of you type a lot slower than you speak. So if someone is reliant on a communication aid, they're only able to communicate a lot slower than maybe verbal people who are around them. Whereas this team from the University of Cambridge and the University of Dundee have developed a new context-aware method that reduces this communication gap by eliminating between 50 and 96% of keystrokes the person has to type. Just say that again. They can eliminate between 50 and 96% of keystrokes someone has to type in order to communicate. So what it does is it listens to the surrounding environment and takes in context-aware clues such as the user's location, the time of day, the identity of the person that they're speaking to suggest sentences that are most relevant. So you can almost train it to be able to speak the way you want to speak and give it very, very short cues to say, that's what I want to say. And in this new system, as the person is typing, algorithms will automatically retrieve the most relevant or previous sentences based on the short bit of text that's been typed and use that context of the conversation that they're involved in. So it's completely life-changing for some non-verbal people who are really limited in how much they're able to express at the moment. It could decrease loneliness and social isolation and help increase the ability to get meaningful work. The repercussions of this type of AI are really quite huge. Another area where AI is brilliant, in my experience as a front-end developer, is in automating tests. So the screenshot that I've included there is of a keyboard interaction list. It's taken from the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. And I have used exactly this to write very short little tests before. So you can automate all of this when you're designing bits of UI, little components. You can set it to be like, this is what I want to happen when these keystrokes happen, and check that everything is working as expected. And AI is absolutely brilliant at consuming that sort of data. You could pass in ARIA Authoring Practices Guide and then almost say, write me automated tests using this technology for this component, using that as your guide. And it will just spit out all of your automated tests for you and really speed up your work. Of course, the caveat is test them yourself as well. Always make sure that you're doing some manual testing. Check that these automated tests are definitely working the way that they should. I've seen a lot of code come out of AI that is incorrect or misleading, particularly around accessibility. So definitely make sure you check it. But once you get into the swing of it with this, it can really speed up your work and lead to more of these things being tested that will just, if everyone did this, it would honestly probably cut down about 80% of my day-to-day work. because so much of my recommendations are often just pointing straight back to these ARIA authoring practices and trying to get people to write code, front-end code usually, in the way that matches the spec and matches the keyboard expectations. So great for AI there. And also a good trend overall is that I think UI patterns are improving. So this screenshot is just giving an example of a list of components with little thumbnail images such as button, checkbox, combo boxes, dialogues. There are so many component libraries out there. And a lot of them like to say they're accessible. They love to say it on the front page that theirs is an accessible library. The first things I usually go and check on their components will be a combo box or a simple disclosure like an accordion. And I'll test it with a keyboard and screen reader. And the vast majority of the time, I find that there's problems, which is quite frustrating when they're making claims. But there is a growing trend of improved, more accessible component patterns. And AI is actually also helping to produce them more faster than ever. So some component libraries that I just want to mention that I think are particularly good for React is probably the most common ones at the moment that I'm seeing that people are asking for. An ARIA kit in React and React ARIA are really starting to buck that trend and make sure that they are genuinely accessible. And this goes back to that trend that I spoke of earlier, where there's a hunger and there's a desire from developers and designers to make things more accessible. The danger, and where AI is performing particularly poorly, is teaching these accessible patterns. But I will come back to that very shortly, because we're going to move on to the bad trends. So what is going in a negative direction, making me sad, when it comes to accessibility? One of the big trends I see, audit, audit, audit. So there's the screenshots here are just showing a whole variety of outputs of various automated scanning tools, just designed to represent, though, that actually there's a real overemphasis and over-reliance on audits for everything. So I think a lot of organizations are really stuck. They're in this kind of audit mindset, and all they're doing is a endless cycle of audits without anything else. And there can be different motivations behind these. And I don't want you to mistake me here. I think audits are a brilliant thing and they're really necessary. But what is less good is that some organizations do an audit and some do nothing with them at all. Some of them are only interested in compliance and they just sort of say, well, all I want to know is, do I pass? And they're not actually interested in spending the time and spending the money and the training resources to equip their teams to deliver truly inclusive solutions that don't form barriers to disabled people. And the other bad thing is some of them just take an audit and they sort of throw it over the fence to their developers. I've seen that so many times because they think of things as it's a code thing. And this really shows a lack of understanding and of organizational maturity about what accessibility is. These types of organizations see audits as some magic bullet, this magic answer, and a way of, I'll have an audit and then I'll have a task list for my developers, find bugs, fix bugs, then we're sorted forever. Whereas actually an audit is more like a health check. It's more like a little MOT, a snapshot, one moment in time. And what they really need to understand is that accessibility touches all levels of their organization, and they need to be far more holistic in their approach, understanding that it touches every single department: marketing, content, ideation, design, acceptance criteria, testing, usability, refinement. Like, accessibility is a code thing, but it's not just a code thing. And sadly, we see a lot of under-resourcing in the accessibility space. So people need to understand that code alone isn't enough, and AI isn't a magic bullet. Ableism and misunderstanding sadly still abound in organizations, and that leads to misunderstandings or I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it, it makes accessibility small. It makes it like it doesn't really matter, like it's only for a very select few people, rather than recognizing that it will affect 25% of their customers or more. And that all comes from ableism and misunderstanding. Investments needed in training and education, and we need a top-down approach. But 18%, according to Forrester, still have accessibility as only kind of a grassroots approach at the moment. And organizations need to understand that there's no quick fix. Accessibility is hard to measure, and it only will cost those organizations more because it's an afterthought. If they invest in training everyone and building in accessibility awareness early, they will end up with more inclusive, well thought out solutions that require less testing, that require less challenges, less problems come up in their audits, and everything just keeps to get progressively better and better and better. Under-resourcing is usually because organizations want very quick, measurable results. It normally comes from the very top of an organization. But sadly, this leaves them focused on compliance rather than real maturity. Another bad thing is I see a lot of poor quality and outdated training. Sadly, particularly for front-end developers, this is a big alert for you. There are a lot of very, very bad examples and patterns out there already. We've had YouTube tutorials coming out now for, I don't know, 20 years or something, maybe more. And a lot of the stuff that they're showing, even some of them that are claimed to be recent, it's beginners teaching other beginners. So there's a lot of bad examples that don't teach accessibility well. So a lot of the time, practitioners aren't being taught good accessible patterns, especially developers. The training resource just isn't there. And they're not being taught HTML. This means that misinformation spreads faster and faster than ever, thanks to all the social media now, thanks to how quick everything is changing and moving. And accessibility is misunderstood or thought of as a big extra task or something that someone has to learn. Like, I have to learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then accessibility. Not really understanding that accessibility is a thread that goes through all of those things. It's too late to learn later. You have to learn it all the way through. So it's bad. Where are the good resources? We need more experts to explain things simply. Accessibility can't keep being equated to, in a lot of developers' minds, it gets equated or slimmed down to meaning blind people. It's just about screen readers, and those are only used by people who are blind, which is just not true. All the assistive technology, there is so much of it. It's so wide. There is speech input, there are switch controls, there are buffer controls, there are different accessibility settings on your devices. It's about raising that awareness so that people reduce their ableism, are more aware of inclusivity, are more aware of the barriers that disabled people face. And the more you learn and the more that you become aware, you need to perpetuate it. We need more skilled accessibility professionals in the space. The demand for the expertise is high, but there really is a shortage of people sharing good practices. So I feel like I've been very depressing there with all of the bad things. So let's have a little look at the things that are maybe a bit more uncertain, because we've covered a lot of good, covered quite a lot of bad. So where is the things in the middle? I'm seeing a lot, sadly, of tokenization and what I've termed purple washing. So greenwashing is the act of making false or misleading statements about how environmentally friendly an organization or its products are. So a water company might say that they are wonderful and they are making brilliant environmentally friendly choices at the same time while pumping sewage into rivers. Greenwashing. Purple washing could be claiming compliance without meeting the standards, publicly committing to accessibility but without any real action, and Sadly, this is often done because of AI-generated marketing blurb. So either marketing teams without real insight are very quick to make accessibility claims, or the data set that AI is learning from is often biased in the first place. And there aren't many protections in place to ensure that claims are genuine. So AI will just say that components are accessible. If you show them a component and you feed it into some AI machine and say, is it accessible? It'll say, great, you've used ARIA there. Brilliant, it's accessible. It might not really be. If you ask it to write marketing content for you, it might make claims that aren't genuine. And these things, obviously, not good. But if they're good, if they're really happening, if something really is accessible, then yes, we should shout about it. If a company is making a genuine commitment, then yes, shout that from the rooftops. That's a wonderful thing. So that's why I'm putting this in the sort of unsure area because of what's happening. I have a reputation for hating JavaScript, which I don't hate JavaScript at all. It just took me quite a long time to learn, I think. And I think it's often added too much. Things are overcomplicated a lot of the time with JavaScript. And a trend that is definitely happening is that we're getting so many new patterns, new frameworks all the time. And there is an over-reliance on JS frameworks like React, like Vue, like Svelte, all of these things. And it's making simple things now complicated. We're getting very performance heavy JS laden sites. We're damaging the environment, killing the planet with consumption. And evolving trends in design are changing long established patterns. So what used to just be perfectly acceptable to have an input with a visible label above it, where an error message might show up in between it and a little icon to highlight where an error is, and it all be very, very clear and simple. Now a trend says, oh, we don't need labels, we'll put them in the placeholder instead, which immediately creates a barrier for cognitive disabilities, because as soon as you start typing, that label disappears. It will probably end up leading to developers implementing inputs without labels. So to a assistive technology user, such as a screen reader user, they're effectively getting a blank input. They don't know what it's for. There's so many things that can get barriers that can get introduced actually because of design trends, or because things are being implemented unnecessarily with a shadow DOM JavaScript framework when it would work perfectly fine as default HTML and would be accessible out the box. A very common one is select dropdowns, which are notoriously hard to style. And the only reason why custom combo boxes are often being used is because people want them to look a bit prettier. People want the drop down to look a bit prettier. And I ask, is that good enough reason to do that? Is that a good enough reason to try and emulate all the functionality of quite a complex HTML component that already exists by default, when you could just use the default component of a select? Another trend I see is that's how YouTube, Amazon, or Apple does it. So a lot of front-end developers, particularly newer learners, they come to me, and if I challenge them or sort of say, this isn't accessible for this reason, they'll say, oh, but that's how they do it over there. And some of these are big players. And it doesn't mean that just because a company is well-known or popular, or if a component framework is being used all over the place, it doesn't mean it's accessible. And it doesn't mean it should be copied. So I've written there A11Y, that means accessibility. That's a shortened version of accessibility. So accessibility patterns just haven't kept pace with the trends that are happening in JavaScript and in design. There are very few of these patterns that are really reliable, which is why I pointed to React ARIA and ARIA Kit before. There are similar ones in other JavaScript frameworks as well, but often if you can come back to just the default HTML and follow that, those will be accessible. And the ARIA practices guide gives you a lot of what you need for these patterns. What we need to do as practitioners is we need to catch up a bit. I want to see more of these component libraries like AriaKit and React Aria that are putting accessibility right front and center of these component libraries. Let's teach more about what's good design and what's accessible design and why. It's all about getting that empathy. Most of the time, people don't design things to be intentionally inaccessible. People don't want to exclude others most of the time. Usually the root of the cause is that they don't understand that they're creating a barrier in the first place. So if we can educate more, help people have more empathy and more awareness of disability, inclusivity, good patterns for design, and how to actually code these things accessibly, then everything will start to get better and better. So it's sort of going in the right direction, but it's just a little caveat to be careful. And speaking specifically now, I've just been speaking to the developers, speaking more to the accessibility professionals. Now, one of the trends that I'm not very keen on that seems to be happening at the moment is we are the accessibility police. This is how I often feel. The audit cycle that we go through often pushes accessibility professionals in this direction, because a huge part of our job is to find problems. I had a reputation in previous job for being the cruelest person when it came to code reviews, other people's code reviews. It almost never happened that I didn't make a comment on a pull request. Sometimes I was just honestly asking a question, trying to understand how something worked, but a lot of the time I was just pointing out small little incremental improvements that could either make something just a little bit more accessible or just a little bit nicer for the end user. But it means that you can get pushed into this place where you get known as like as someone that's just there to catch everyone out. And all we want to do is be angry at people and attack people and tell them how they've got everything wrong, which isn't our heart and it's not our job. We need to get much more soft. And this is what I work on myself. My communication style is extremely direct. So I often get challenged, rightly so, to be a little bit kinder in the way that I raise issues. And Nemensa has been brilliant at improving the way I write about issues, my team around me, that we help each other and we try and make sure that we use human language and help always keep the focus rather than what is wrong with something. Always try and push the focus back to how it creates a barrier for someone. So who is it that is being excluded potentially by this thing? Because then you're shifting away from the sort of attacking and you're moving into the empathy and helping people understand. And this happens because this whole like we are the police thing, it happens because accessibility attracts really passionate people. We care about inclusivity. And when you see people being excluded, I want to fight for them. I want to defend them. I want to make sure that no matter what happens, that there are no more barriers for these people. And it leads to a lot of us being perfectionists. Also, a lot of people in the accessibility space have neurodivergent communication challenges, and that's absolutely fine. I think we have to accept that sometimes when someone is being direct with you, if you are offended by the way they have communicated it with you, pause for a minute and just properly listen to what it was they said, the actual words that they said, because the chances are a lot of the time when people are direct, and we do have a tendency sometimes to be overly direct, the heart behind it is actually, what did they say? They meant what they said. They didn't have extra hidden meaning behind it. It wasn't an attack and it was never intended as an attack. So try and think the best of people when you are challenged on something being inaccessible. I think as an industry and as professionals, there's a big difference between healthy debate and polarizing opinions expressed aggressively. Try not to get drawn in to arguments so much. I'm seeing a lot of debates at the moment about things like units to use for font size or for media queries or whatever it might be. I have my opinions on them, and I'll express my opinions. But if people disagree with me, they're free to disagree with me. And I think that that is all part of having this healthy debate. Every single solution is going to be a little bit different. Developers are going to have different preferences. Designers are going to have different preferences. The goal is that together we move everything into a more accessible, more inclusive space. And we just need to stop telling everyone off. That's a note to myself a lot of the time. Be kind in your communication. If you work in accessibility, understand that it's a journey. If someone is ableist, if they express something that is insensitive, or if they make something inaccessible, it's generally not intentional. Be kind, bring them along on the journey, help them understand disability, help them understand different types of assistive technology. Be kind in the way that you communicate about problems to do with accessibility. It is all about empathy and gentle instruction, even in the face of ableism. Even if you do encounter something that offends you, try not to just react. Slow down, be kind in your challenge back. Try and lead people to a good place so that they come away from it willing to listen, not tense and angry at you for the way you've communicated. And I've added a little PS on the slide because I really do admit I am often very, very bad at this. And this is I'm almost preaching to myself here as something that I am always trying to get better at. And I like direct communication. I'm a very direct person, and I appreciate when other people are direct with me. So I don't generally mind when someone is abrupt, or even if other people might think that something is aggressive when someone communicates with me. Most of the time, I don't react in a bad way. Sometimes I do. But I quite like that direct communication. If I put something out there for feedback, I'm quite happy to get a list of 20 problems with it with no encouragement. But not everyone else is like that. And through working at the Mensa, it's definitely teaching me to be softer and to be kinder in my communication. And others, even people that I am mentoring through Front End Mentor is a platform that I mentor on quite a lot, but through other online spaces, through spending time with them, I'm starting to learn from other mentors and from the people that I teach that encouragement goes a long way. So try and find some good even in amongst the bad. Try and make sure that we are not being aggressive in the way that we communicate, because then we can turn one of these ugly trends into a positive and tip the balance in a good way. So I suppose the whole purpose of this entire talk covered a lot of things, and I probably talked too fast, but it's coming back to that question of how can we steer and shape all of these different trends for good. So particularly the things that are bad or ugly in the way that I've talked about them, how can we shape them in the right direction? So I come up with a few things. So number one is know AI's limits when it comes to accessibility. Be clear on the limits of AI and where it's useful for us as accessibility professionals. For example, it is good for automation and generating test scripts, but we need human evaluation. Don't rely on it for everything, and don't blindly trust whatever it's giving you. It's great for new technology, for new trends, for new things that can help people in different ways who maybe have various different disabilities, but just know its limits. Number two, encourage accessibility because it trumps compliance. Steer clients or any organizations you work with, whether it's your own employer or other organizations, steer them towards investments in a maturity program, starting with awareness training for all and more specific training for different roles, such as design, development, and content teams. Help them understand a maturity program and what that actually means. I think we probably have to cover what a maturity program is in a whole different talk. But really, it would start with training. It would start with awareness training. It would include things like audits, but it would also include gap analysis. It will include various different policies. It's a way of making accessibility be considered in every single area of your organization, at every single stage, and in every single role. Can sound absolutely huge, but actually there are some great plans out there that you could be led along to help you become more mature in terms of accessibility and get beyond that sort of just endless audit cycle. Number 3, kindly share your knowledge and lift others up. So be empathetic and gentle in our language. Don't be accessibility police. Don't get drawn into arguments about why accessibility matters or how wrong stuff is. Point things out. Raise issues. If you see things that are claiming to be accessible and they're not, don't run in with the "this is not accessible." Instead, let's say, hey, I've noticed these things because I just tested in this way, and here are the barriers, and this is the problem it could cause for these people, and here is how you would solve it. Open pull requests on component libraries if you notice that things are inaccessible, or open issues, but be sure to keep the focus on the barriers of why it's a problem and how to solve that problem. And if you're not sure how to solve it, then open up a dialogue to try and find out how to. Number 4 is all about empathy over enforcement. So just as I was just saying, don't be the police. We want to generate content to help others learn. Simple explanations with a focus on the barriers. Don't get drawn into those arguments. Make sure that people always keep that focus back on the fact that accessibility isn't just about code. It's about so much more. It's about inclusion. It's about including people with disabilities. It's not about enforcing or bashing people over the head when they get it wrong, because we all make mistakes. I look back at code that I wrote even a year ago, and I wouldn't do it the same now. Similar with designs that I did when I was a designer several years ago. I look at them and think, oh, they're so poor for accessibility, whether it's contrast or whether it's missing labels or whether I'm using inappropriate elements for different things. It's all over the place. But that brings me to number 5. It is about progress over perfection. And some people in the accessibility space really hate that phrase. A lot of disabled people hate that phrase, understandably, because they think that it would mean that we're not aiming for perfection. And we are. I'm a perfectionist. I want everything to be fully accessible. I would love it if the entire world was completely accessible, completely inclusive, and perfect. But the reason why I like this phrase of progress over perfection is that you can't do everything overnight, sadly. Keep clients focused on the progress instead of pure compliance. Take them with you on a journey and help them understand that every single improvement they make is removing a barrier for someone. It's including some more people. And if we stay on that journey and they keep track, then they'll get there eventually. So that is kind of bringing me to the end. Oh dear, my links have gone. That's poor contrast of my links on the slide there. Apologies about that. I'll make that better after this talk. So I think we want to open it up to questions. So I'm going to hand over because I can't see the chat from in here, so I can't see what questions have been asked. If any.
just for those of you who asked, the session is recorded, and Flavio and Rajiv will respond about how the links will be shared.
Like Rajiv has said in the chat, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel. Tish, do you want to start reading the questions? I think there's only one.
So we do have one from Gemma who's asked for a link to the guide from the presentation. Otherwise,
which guide do we know? The ARIA guide or the W3C, the web WCAG 3.0 guide? One of those.
Maybe we can share both, Grace.
Yeah, I think we can. I'm sure we can share both.
Yeah, and Gemma just confirm both, please. Denise has just said, great presentation, Grace. Joe said earlier, thanks so much, Grace. Richard has said, be the fireman, not the policeman, is a phrase he's keen on and reminds himself of on a regular basis.
That's a great phrase. I might steal that, actually. I like the idea.
Alistair.
I like the idea of being a guide rather than so thinking of it more as taking someone on a journey, leading someone, rather than being there to just find problems all the time.
Completely understand. I think brilliant phrase. Alistair has asked, can you describe a bit more about how you've automated access testing to check W3 design patterns?
Yeah, sure. I wonder whether, is it best maybe if I stop sharing? Perhaps. I know we can go back up to share again afterwards. I'm not actually sure how to stop sharing. Oh, there we go, stop share. Just 1 minute. I find it a little bit easier while I'm answering the questions. So for automated testing, there are a few different things that you can do. There's various different testing libraries out there. And to be honest, it would have to be a whole talk in itself to go through specifically accessibility testing. But I would draw people back again and again, particularly with UI testing, which is where I, as a developer, have focused most of my attention. So most of it would be developing front-end interfaces. So testing, for example, something like an accordion or a combo box or a modal or things like that. All of those keyboard interactions can be automated in their testing. And that's where I'd point back to those ARIA authoring practices guide. So I haven't got any examples that I can share on screen. That's what I was just looking for on my computer to see if I had any just to hand. But pretty much you can write code with things like Jest, Cypress. Playwright is more for changing all different different screens and testing across different browsers, but particularly for like testing individual interfaces, then things like Jest and Cypress work quite well. And you can make it say, click this button and then check whether something changes. So it could check automatically, has ARIA expanded changed from false to true on opening of an accordion, for example. And if it hasn't, it will fail. You can make your build fail, or it can just give you a failure on that specific test. If everything works, you just get a load of ticks in your console, everything's fine, and you then know you don't sort of need to test that necessarily as a developer. But I would, although I'm all for automated testing, I would encourage everyone to do a certain amount of manual testing, no matter what. Particularly with keyboard, the absolute minimum that you can do as a developer, as a front-end developer, would be a keyboard test. That would be my baseline minimum, and an automated scan using a browser extension. You can automate some of those things anyway, but I always like to do it just to make sure, because you could get things like focus visible outlines could actually not be quite enough, have quite enough contrast, things like that, that you may not have a test for. And it could take you quite a while to build up a suite of tests like that. But the good thing is they're often transferable. So you might need certain ARIA to change, and you're actually only going to need to change 1 or 2 words once you've written a few of those tests. And I have given the ARIA authoring practices, I think, to Gemini, Google Gemini, and to ChatGPT, and the tests that came out were actually pretty solid. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, let us know in the chat, Alistair. Yes, that's great. Richard has a question. Is there a role for certification in the accessibility field? I'm aware of the IAAP certification program. However, I fear the expense could prove a barrier for many capable people. I'm also aware that some perhaps not entirely qualified people are entering the field due to the increased demand driven in part by legislation.
Yeah, that's a difficult question, but I think that's where organisations like Purple Beard come in, to be honest.
Yes.
So good training providers. Unfortunately, there aren't, as far as I know, there aren't any other certifications. And although I am CPAC certified and pursuing the Web Accessibility Specialist certification, I'm actually not 100% sure whether I am going to carry on with that or not, for similar reasons to what you said, the expense. And I find that the exams actually aren't the best way to test the knowledge. I'm getting so much benefit just from reading the materials that they put out. And for me, that feels like enough, and I don't need the certification. But for people who are newer in the space, I'm sort of 50-50 on whether certifications are actually necessary. I would definitely recommend everyone do the Intro to Web Accessibility course, which is provided by edX, and it is promoted on the W3C site on the accessibility guidelines. We can send a link out to that as well. It's an absolutely brilliant course, mainly because it shows and it involves a lot of people with a lot of different disabilities. It teaches you about different technology and how it's helping them. So I think it's really important to get the awareness up. But as far as certification, a lot of people in the space aren't so fussed about it, to be honest. I think in an interview, I would know very quickly whether someone is qualified or not, based off talking to them and seeing their examples of what they would put out and what they would advise. And I think that that's what a lot of people in the industry will do as far as hiring. But I don't know if Purple Beard have anything additional to add on that particular question.
No, I think that's a brilliant thing. I mean, it's a really, really good segue into something that I was going to talk about a little bit later anyway. So, you know, accessibility, like Grace has mentioned before, is more than just a box ticking exercise. We really need to be passionate about creating inclusive digital experiences. And so what we do at Purple Beard is we were the first in the UK to run the Digital Accessibility Specialist Level 4 apprenticeship. And we've designed this apprenticeship to equip everyone with comprehensive skills and knowledge to become proficient in digital accessibility. We cover a wide range of topics, from the legislation and frameworks around accessibility, creating accessible content. We look at assistive tools and technology, project management for accessibility, testing and auditing digital platforms, as well as some development. So we do look at accessible development and accessible design as well. So, I mean, it's not quite the CPAC certification, but we do want to ensure that people are well trained and they have enough hands-on experience and practical knowledge to be able to start and to continue in a career in accessibility, but not just that, but to make a meaningful impact. So if you want more information about our digital accessibility specialist apprenticeship, please feel free to contact us using any of the links below. You've also heard it here first. We are also working on a short form, because the apprenticeship itself is 2 years long, including the endpoint assessment, but we are looking at a short version, which we're launching at the end of this year. So watch this space. if you are interested in good quality training, please do let us know. And we have one of our apprentices who just popped up in the chat. Hi, Shannon. Thank you so much for that. So yeah, feel free to let us know if you're interested, whether it's in the short course or in the apprenticeship as well. We'd love to hear from you.
And were there any other questions?
Yes, I was just about to say, Amy has a question. Do you have any process for tools or programs your teams use in-house to ensure that they are accessible?
For web or for like, are we talking sort of documents, internal processes, I suppose would be my almost question back to whoever asked that one. There are certainly for web, there are lots of tools I like to use that I'm happy to demonstrate a couple if we have time. Have they replied to that? I'm just going to try and get the chat open.
No reply yet, but Amy, the mics are enabled. If you want to just shout out, please feel free.
Yeah, sure, that would be great, thank you. It was more just in terms of ensuring that your workspace is also accessible, so not just looking at the products that we're creating, but you know, bringing inclusivity into the workplace as well.
Right, yeah. So that is where that accessibility maturity program really comes into it for us. I actually think it's one of the areas that Nemensa is looking at ourselves, because we certainly have some in-house tools that went through a procurement process and accessibility wasn't considered, which happens at pretty much every organization because it only takes one person or one tool to go and do some research and look into something and then forget about accessibility, which is always the problem if it's left until late. You also have the problem where a lot of tools promise that they are accessible when they're not. So I would point then to having a look at some accessibility maturity programs. There's loads and loads of information about them online. We have a few in-house ourselves. We actually do run it as a service at Nemensa, and we need to run it internally, in all honesty, like on ourselves, to make sure that we improve things. There are also some processes that you can do as an organization as far as documents. So we have some document templates, so some templates for presentations, for Word documents, for PowerPoints, with some checklists. They have some guidance about writing alt text on images, about tagging PDFs. So you can start to do some of those sort of things. And it's just a question of making sure that there is the time to do those checks before putting things out as an organization. Sadly, a lot of tools that we rely on are not that accessible. So working as a developer, there was a lot of tools for, planning your tasks, task management, bug fixing, project management tools. And a lot of them, they're highly interactive. They're actually extremely difficult to make accessible unless it's been designed that way from the start. And it's always going to be hard, and none of them are probably going to be perfect. But it's a case of finding the ways around as best you can with those. And when you have accessibility problems with them, raising them with the third party. I've raised quite a few issues in the past with third parties like OneTrust. I think they've implemented quite a few of my recommendations. So companies often do respond quite well if you tell them if you find an accessibility problem. So if there is a tool you use and you find text contrast is poor, something doesn't work with keyboard, whatever it might be, by all means raise it with them. Ask how you can raise an issue, get in contact with them, tell them exactly why it's a problem, and if you can, tell them how to fix it. If you don't know how to fix it, then that's okay. But if you can tell them, that will be more likely to get it fixed quicker. I hope that helps.
And I mean, Grace, if you do have some time and you want to share some of the maturity models, that would be great.
Well, let's have a look. I definitely have some that should be bookmarked, I hope. So there is the most obvious one is here, the most obvious place to go. It's always going to pretty much be the W3C. This is only a draft note at the moment, and it's giving a load of different maturity level points, but it's following the same kind of guidance as what some of the others are. The other place that I would recommend, and I probably shouldn't be recommending a competitor, but I do know that this organization have some wonderful stuff to do with maturity models, and their training is very, very good. They also have regular webinars. They have covered things like maturity models, and they have a tool called a scorecard that you can run, that you can use, which I've used with people before, which I imagine they should have on here. Yeah, so make your draft accessibility plan in 1 hour. This ISO 300711 scorecard. They've got a little webinar about it. It is a really, really good tool just to measure where you are. So you can send it out to a few organizational leaders. So even if you end up not working necessarily with Hassle Inclusion or with a third party or with an organization like Mensa, it will still help you understand where you are. How you're doing for accessibility, and give you some pointers for where you might want to go next. So it organizes it into different categories. So it might say that your governance needs more work, but your development is very strong in accessibility, that kind of thing, to help you split it. And I've just seen that someone's asked what the guides were that I mentioned earlier. So we can go to ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. This is the main guide that I refer to a lot. This is what I use for testing, the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. It has this wonderful page called Patterns. I'll zoom out just a little there. That has a lot of common patterns that you'll see, just regular UI that you will see across different sites. And this is where you would go. So if you wanted to see what accessibility requirements are for a disclosure, so that's a show hide, it will tell you exactly what keyboard interactions are expected. Similar with accordions. Accordions are a bit different because it's a whole set of show hides. So then you have some extra keyboard interactions that would be expected, such as the arrow keys. And they also have examples of some of these. If you were to go and have a look at their examples, your design may be slightly different, but it's giving you an idea of how these things should work. I will know that these will work with keyboard, that they will work with screen reader. And it gives you everything, what has happened with the keyboard support, what the role, state property, and tab index attributes are doing. So this is such a great resource to be using, even if your design doesn't look exactly like it. I've seen someone in the chat has mentioned the AbilityNet digital accessibility maturity model useful. That's also a really good one. There are quite a few. I learned about loads of them on the CPAC, and now that I'm being asked about them, I can't remember the names of any of the specific ones that I used. I do have quite a few bookmarked. But I would definitely recommend that people check out the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide if you're at all involved in UI design. One thing that I will say, if there are any designers here, a common thing that I see happening is a confusion between different UI patterns between mobile and desktop. So quite often you will see accordions on mobile that then become tabs. You know, like these sort of tabs on desktop will become a stacked accordion on mobile. but they do have quite different keyboard interfaces and different accessibility expectations in terms of ARIA. So I would beg designers to be consistent between mobile and desktop. It's a really common issue, is mixing up design patterns, because as soon as you mix them up and you say, I'm going to use a tab on a desktop and I'm going to use accordion on a mobile, you are potentially doubling the development work that will be needed there if they're going to build it accessibly, because they may have to duplicate markup and make things very complicated with JavaScript. So try to keep things consistent if you can. Were there any other questions, or have I missed anything? I'm just having a little look through the chat myself.
So Richard has just put in the chat that they found the AbilityNet digital accessibility maturity model to be useful.
Yep.
And he was just talking about the importance of executive level sponsorship. Really, really quite important.
Definitely. Definitely. I think that that's one of those things that I'm seeing as a trend. So when we talk about accessibility maturity, is that we often see grassroots. We see someone in an organization, and I used to be that person at probably 3 or 4 organizations I've worked at before. I was the loud voice of accessibility in the organization, and I became the point person who any question about accessibility came to. The problem with that is that unless you get the buy-in at executive level, at the top level, that's all it's going to stay. It's going to stay concentrated in that one person. And then when I left those organizations, they may be a little bit more aware than what they were, but suddenly, you know, there's a big void there. Whereas if they've given the investment from the top and the training, and they followed one of these accessibility maturity models, and they understand the scope of what we're actually talking about, then they'll be in a much better place, and it won't all be tied on one person. The other thing that I would really recommend is if that is you, if you are that one person in an organization, is to try and set up what's called an accessibility champions network. Absolutely love these when you see them. So it's a way of getting other people who are interested in accessibility, who might be in all different spaces across your organization, and almost forming a working group around accessibility. There's quite a few things about those online as well, and some different examples about those. And I'm just going to find another excellent resource. I should have had some of these ready for you before. If anyone, I don't know if anyone is aware of brilliant accessibility professional called Craig Abbott, who has a fantastic blog, and I can't recommend this particular blog enough, defining an accessibility strategy. He goes into it in quite a lot of detail about how you can do it. So if you are the person who is trying to kind of push this at your organization, I'd encourage you to have a good read of this particular blog that focuses on different pillars of accessibility, compliance, culture, and education, and how you can come at it from those 3 angles. But whoever it was in the chat, I can't see who it was, but you do need that executive buy-in, and this is how you will convince them, I think.
And I've just popped that in the chat as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so if nobody has any more questions, comments, or anything like that, I want to say thank you so much to Grace for being here with us today. Rajiv's popped a link in the chat to our next Lunch and Learn with Grace on October the 8th. I also want to say thank you to everybody who's participated. I mean, we've explored the good, the bad, the ugly of digital accessibility trends, from refining standards like the WCAG 2.2 and the European Accessibility Act to the potential risk of over-reliance on audits and the misuse of AI in accessibility claims. Grace looked at the importance of going beyond compliance to really embedding accessibility into the core of digital design and development. We looked at the powerful role that AI can play, whether through automatic translation, captioning, or biometric validation. But overall, it is clear that human intervention is really still crucial for effective accessibility. We also looked at the role that peer-to-peer can play in meeting your training needs around digital accessibility, whether it's through the apprenticeship or our short course coming soon at the end of this year. So again, thank you to everyone for your participation. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.